Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center webinar series. Tonight's session is titled The History of White Supremacy, and we're joined tonight by Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith from Duke University. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm joining you tonight from my home in Chapel Hill. Just down the road from me, Adriane is at Duke University in Durham, and just a little bit farther than that is Libby Taylor, my colleague, and really the mastermind behind our webinar series. Libby works with our scholars to associate and coordinate the materials, make sure you get the readings and the pre-selected materials by the historian in advance, and also works with you behind the scenes to make sure that the webinar experience is a good one. I want to thank Libby for her hard work as always, and let you know that if you have any questions tonight, or if there's anything that is not quite going right for you, that you could find her in the attendees box and send her a private message and ask her for some help. Tonight's webinar is going to be an audio and chat only webinar. So you will not be able to see Adriane and myself, but we are going to count on your voice, and that voice will be registered through the chat box. We're going to ask you to register questions, to share thoughts, to post resources. You can talk directly to myself and to Adriane. Part of my job tonight as a moderator will be to cull through and curate those questions and then insert them into Adriane's conversation as best I can. You can also have conversations with each other, and I think for all of our topics, but certainly tonight, we do want to have a conversation around how to talk through and to work with younger students around difficult topics like white supremacy and race and place and social construct. If you haven't signed in the web version tonight, you might get a better functionality if you sign out of web and sign back in through the desktop app. I also want to make sure that you're muted tonight. So if you log in and for some reason your audio seems live, your mic seems live, then you can find on your screen the audio toggle mic and go ahead and turn that off for me as well. National Humanities Center is designed to really bridge the gap between scholarship and research and understanding and content with the classroom, with the teaching and learning that we do at all levels. And I'd like you to think of the Humanities Center as a laboratory space, really, as a place where these kind of deeper conversations around understanding something better and then making sense of it with younger students can occur. We like to do that by leveraging and accessing really the elite scholarship that we have around the country. We have a fellowship class that joins us every Labor Day and stays for a full year to do their good work. At this point, 40 years in, we've got nearly 1,400 alumni who have contributed to humanities understanding through their research and through their projects. And we also like to design projects in which scholars and academics work side by side with teachers to really think through the pedagogy of how to then take humanities to younger students. I'd invite you to check out our website and look at all the different ways that we try to do that for you as classroom teachers. That includes our online instructional resources found in our America in Class repository. These are free and open and available for download at any time. You'll see that these lessons are very narrowly targeted and meant to be aspirational, so we encourage you to modify them and mix them and find different ways to use them with students of all ages and levels. We'd also like you to share with us what you do with those lessons so that we have some sense of the way that they've impacted your classroom. Our webinar series is an attempt to create these kinds of 90-minute conversations around compelling topics. Tonight's session is sold out. It doesn't surprise me at all given the world that we live in right now. And you'll find as you scroll through the long list of webinars scheduled for this year that many of our topics are relevant and contemporary. You know, every single day kids walk into your classroom with questions about the world they live in. It's a very confusing time. And I think our webinars this year are designed to give you the kinds of tools, the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of content that can help you navigate and feel confident in the conversations you have with students, even if that material is not in your curriculum. When they come and sit in your classroom, they're talking about the headlines and they're talking about things that concern them and they have questions about, and this is really a chance for you to to gain a deeper, sort of have a space at the end of the day to have a deeper conversation around those things. I would encourage you to go ahead and sign up for all the webinars that you're interested in. We do have a cap at 200 on our webinar series, session I should say, and it's helpful to go ahead and get your name registered. And then if for some reason you realize you can't make it, the day gets crazy, we would ask you to email Libby and take your name off the list so we can add someone from our waiting list. And I know that looking in the back end through our roster that many of our fall sessions are close to capacity at this point. We do try to maintain a relevancy and a connection with the classroom, and we do that primarily through a teacher advisory council. This group of 14 just wonderful established educators from around the country have agreed to serve the center for the next year and really let us know how we can make sure that our materials make sense in the daily reality of the classroom. We've asked them to contribute into to benefit from the work we do in a variety of ways, and if any of you are interested in serving in the same capacity, we'll be opening applications for the 2018-19 year this spring, and I would encourage you to keep an eye on that. At the end of tonight's session, you will receive a pop-up screen that asks you to do a survey, and once that survey is completed, you'll receive an email with a copy of your certificate of participation. You can take the certificate to your administration or put it in your teaching portfolio and get credit for being here tonight. We are finding, however, that because this is a mass-generated email that comes from the GoToMeeting platform, that sometimes your school filters are rigorous and they put those in spam almost immediately, or they bury them somewhere in your cyber infrastructure. So take a look for them, dig around a little bit. If you don't get that email by the next morning, then I'd encourage you to email Libby or myself, and we'll do our best to track it down for you, or we'll send you an alternative certificate as well. Once you click on that, by the way, you will have to download the certificate. So really take a moment to look for that email and to find that certificate before it falls off your radar. Of course, we have a full virtual room of teachers and educators tonight. You can probably tell because you're jostled in and you're sitting side by side with folks from literally all over the country. But you also have a deep and established professional and personal network behind each one of you. I would encourage you to find ways tonight to share tonight's session with your social network. Twitter is something we use pretty extensively at the center, and I've listed some of the handles that you can use. But any way that you can register this conversation and these resources and materials for the larger educator community and humanities would be very helpful, and I'd encourage you to do that. So it's interesting. I actually put together this year's seminar series of topics last spring. And it was important for me then to almost have a rip from the headlines kind of feeling. I really did want to provide and to articulate the value of the humanities as a tool to understand the world we live in. Knowing that, again, kids of all ages, younger students, high school students, college-age students, adult colleagues of yours, you know, we're faced on an almost regular basis now with problems and issues and questions that we're just trying to make sense of. And so it was unfortunate how relevant tonight's topic really became. As a longtime resident of the Charlottesville area, it really struck home for me personally. I see some of my Charlottesville colleagues in our webinar tonight. I'm happy to see that you joined us. And I think really by design what we want to do is offer maybe a larger way to have the conversation around white supremacy and what it really means in terms of historical context and in terms of the American context. And so Adriane Lentz-Smith, who's a historian at Duke University, is, I'm sure, and again, in sort of a bittersweet way, asked to speak on this topic quite often. And I'm super pleased to have you here tonight to give us your insights to this particular theme in American history and the ways that we can hopefully make sense of it. So Adriane, I've activated your mic. Hey Adriane, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hi everybody.
Well, thank you for being here. And Adriane, I'm going to pass you the mouse if I haven't already and ask you to introduce yourself a little bit more, but we've got a full room of folks, and my job tonight will be to facilitate the questions, and don't feel funny at all about following whatever trail they might lead you on, but at some point I might keep us on time as well.
Okay, that sounds great. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Adriane Lentz-Smith. I'm Associate Professor of History in Duke University's History Department. I also teach in the African and African American Studies departments and in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies departments. I wrote a book, you can see it on the PowerPoint slide, called Freedom Struggles, African Americans in World War I. And it's a book that looks at the Black freedom struggle or the sort of long civil rights movement centered in the World War I years. And it uses soldiers to talk about manhood, citizenship, the ways that African Americans imagine the world, and the ways that they live within and against white supremacy in the early part of the 20th century. And I will admit I'm a little bit sad that I don't have a harder job right now of convincing people that the history that I work on is relevant to the lives that they live. But right now, in this moment, everyone seems to know that. I didn't quite expect when I said that I would do this webinar that the topic would be as centrally relevant as it's turned out to be. And so part of what I've been trying to figure out how to do in preparing for this webinar is to give you enough of the bigger history to contextualize, which I think is important. I think it's important to move back from a sort of what seems so current and what seems so urgent, and just breathe for a second and think through not just where we are, but how where we are is inherited from where we've been. So what I've done in structuring this webinar is to actually spend some time with the history, spend some time in the 1870s through 1890s and into the early part of the 20th century, and sort of see like where we get this system that we call white supremacy. And then I'm going to move forward and try to offer what are really almost tentative ways, for me at least, to think about how we have inherited perhaps a remade, reimagined, reformulated system of white supremacy. Again, to try to think through what's going on without simply reacting to kind of the pageantry and the immediate hideousness of what's in front of us. So,
hey, Adriane, that's a really great frame, and I hate to interrupt you so early in your conversation tonight, but I do want to ask one question, and that is, you noted at least this sort of hinge point where, we agreed to do this in the spring, and we weren't quite sure. We didn't realize that it would be quite so relevant, and you talked about the way that you really don't have to convince people that this work is important right now. Was there a moment when that occurred? It surely wasn't Charlottesville necessarily, but was there some time or some place in the past year, 2 years, whenever it is, that work became immediately and obviously and explicitly relevant?
I think it was sometime in the 2016 election. I started teaching, really teaching. I started at Duke in 2007. And so in the lead up to a different election. And I found then that when I taught African American history, or said that I worked on African American history, or the history of white supremacy, however I framed it, that students were only mediumly interested. And they believed, and very much wanted to believe, that we lived, as the rhetoric went then, in a post-racial society. They felt burdened by knowing a history that they didn't want to be implicated in. And I think one of the perverse effects of having a Black president, of seeing a kind of increase in the deaths of kids my students' age at the hands of police or on the streets or what have you, of seeing the emergence of kind of alternative political movement where so much of the language of protest was couched in the language of race, made them start to question and wonder whether things were as post as they wished that they wished them to be. And so I think that really crested in 2016, and in how intense and ugly things got. Combined here in North Carolina with the shooting of the man in Charlotte at the same time that I was teaching a lecture course on the civil rights movement.
Right, right. Thank you. As we teach and think about this, it occurs to me that in the future we're going to look back for some of these hinge points, and it's just interesting to hear you sort of articulate it so quickly and so recently.
Yeah, and I was so surprised by where my students were in 2008. Right, I was so surprised by their investment in the language of a post-racial America, but I was equally surprised to realize how quickly that story disintegrated in the face of just the sort of litany of current events that made it a hard narrative to hold on to.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. So I am going to figure out how to use the mouse. There, and I'm going to take us forward. A click. I should say So. And I'm going to ask the question to start, what do we talk about or what do we think of when we think of white supremacy? I think many people think first and immediately of its cornerstone, segregation, or as segregation and the entire system was colloquially known in the South, they think of Jim Crow, an elaborate system of laws and customs that lent the sanction of law to a system of racial ostracism that extended to almost every walk of life, right? Churches and schools, housing and jobs, eating and drinking. It extended to public transportation, to sports and recreation, to hospitals. Even blood was segregated. I don't know how many people know about the sort of protests in the World War II era when African Americans were protesting the Red Cross's refusal to use black blood for white soldiers, but then also to orphanages, prisons, asylums, morgues, cemeteries. I should say we tend to think of Jim Crow as a Southern system, but segregation was in fact a Northern practice as well as a Southern one. And in fact, in the years before the Civil War, in the antebellum years, segregation was common in the North, in part because people needed a way, without the sort of line of slave versus free, to separate out people. Segregation gave white Northerners a place to put free blacks and to reassure themselves that while they were not enslaved, they were not the same as the white population. And in the same way, white supremacy, as it develops after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, becomes in large part a national, not a regional system. Finding a way to demarcate African Americans from the sort of broader body of Americans, from white Americans, took on increased urgency in the wake of emancipation, so after 1865. And thus segregation came on some level to govern African Americans' lives in the decades after the Civil War. What you see happening is that from the 1890s on, it hardens from custom in most parts of the United States to law in most of the parts of the ex-Confederacy. These laws would dictate where people lived, whether they voted, whom they might love, how they might work. Statutes that required segregated public facilities were passed as far west as Arizona, as far north as Wyoming and Indiana. Laws against miscegenation, or racial intermixture, extended beyond the South to all of the western states, except Washington and New Mexico, and into the Midwest, into Indiana and Nebraska. Other sanctions, both legal and social, governed how African Americans behaved, how they carried themselves in public, how they addressed white women and white children and white men, how they aspired to security or to self-improvement. We also tend to think, and as this slide, I think, drives home, we tend to think of the most rabid face of white supremacy when we talk about white supremacy. We think of the racists and the terrorists who victimized African American men, women, and children in the decades after the first Reconstruction of the 1860s through the first part of the 20th century and on into the second Reconstruction of the 1960s. We tend to think of the Klan, of lynching, of raging mobs, and of extralegal violence. Because I have written so much about the progressive era, so the period from the 1870s into the 1930s, I think of spectacle lynchings, right? These broad public lynchings in which thousands or hundreds of people would take trains out to some spot to see a fellow human burned or shot, and would sometimes take away souvenirs, or take pictures and circulate postcards. I think of the pogroms of that period. I think of the Atlanta riot in 1906, of the East St. Louis, Illinois massacre in 1917. I think of Tulsa in 1921, in which mobs invaded Black neighborhoods and Black business districts, destroying homes, destroying businesses, murdering and assaulting people. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary in 2 years of the Red Summer of 1919, right? A wave of riots, and not what we think of now, right? Destruction of property riots, but really like mass murders and attacks on people, sort of mobs of folks bent on violence, killing people in Black communities. In the wake of World War I, we had a series of riots everywhere from Longview, Texas to maybe Omaha, Nebraska, but the most famous of them in Chicago and Washington, D.C., 10 riots between the end of 1918 and the end of 1919, 100 lynchings in that period, including soldiers in uniform, right? So you think on some level of a litany of horrors, horrors that are difficult to talk about, difficult to ask students to think about, but I think also necessary for them to know so that they understand that when we talk about segregation or when we talk about the age of Jim Crow, we're doing more than just talking about separate schools or different water fountains. A lot of other people think of the post-World War II years of mobs in Little Rock protesting desegregating schools in the 1950s, or police sicking German shepherds on protesters in Birmingham in early 1963. They think of the murder of Emmett Till, particularly since the release of my colleague Tim Tyson's book, The Blood of Emmett Till, earlier this year. For the folks who have watched Ezra Edelman's amazing documentary on OJ, right? They might think of the beating of Rodney King, and the shooting of Latasha Harlins, and the sort of upheaval in LA in the mid 1990s or early 1990s that followed that. Or since this past August, they probably think of Charlottesville. In other words, in popular understanding, white supremacy has become, in large part, synonymous with what one historian has called the Jim Crow routine. His phrase captures how Jim Crow made a ritual out of asserting people of color's unequal citizenship and a virtue out of white Americans' ability to exploit them. To be clear, as I just said, this was never about drinking fountains. It was, in some instances, about managing intimacy, how people live up and against and next to one another in cities. But more, it was about domination. It was about maintaining a sense of racial hierarchy. It was about keeping power in the hands, not of all white people, but of white elites who could convince other folks to go along with them by arguing that if they had nothing else in this world, they had the knowledge that they were better, so the argument went, than the Black folks who lived alongside them. So we should do more, and this is in the way that I've structured this lecture, we should do more than focus on white supremacy's horrors or the pageantry of white supremacists taking themselves out into the street to announce themselves. And while one should never overlook white supremacy as terror, because that is central to how it maintains itself, central to what we know about it, to do so without reckoning with the politics of white supremacy is to miss some fundamentals, not just about the history of white supremacy in the US, but of US history, period, in the long 20th century. So this evening, I'm going to try to talk about white supremacy's logic, its structure to some extent, and its effects. I'm deliberately not talking about racism because so much of that conversation tends to focus on individual behavior or individual intent rather than on structures and effects. As I often tell my students somewhere in the beginning of my civil rights movement lecture class, I say, look, guys, Black people don't actually care whether or not you like them. We can make friends. We can meet other people. That part is fine. The issue at hand, the issue in the Black freedom struggle, the issue for folks in the civil rights movement was whether or not they had the space, the ability, the resources, and the power to live lives as fully and fairly as other folks in the United States, right? We shorthand that as racism, but if we only ever talk about winning over hearts and minds, we actually miss a lot of the bigger parts of the struggle.
And it sounds, Adriane, as you frame it in that way, it sounds too that as our teachers discuss this with younger students, then it's not just a story of broken bodies and violence, but is this sort of institutional, systematic thing.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that thinking about institutional things, thinking about systematic things, thinking about how work continues to get done even when there's not a specific person that you can point to and say is doing it is actually really hard. It's hard to wrap your brains around. But I think being able to think about that kind of level of causality, to think about institutions, to think about structures is actually is really important for all kinds of broader analytical thinking, right? I'm someone who thinks through stories and who tends to have characters in books because that's how I organize my understanding. But I also know that not everything that I'm talking about is personalized. And so the balance between having people carry an analysis or having something that my students can latch onto, someone that my students can latch onto, just do the intellectual work through, versus having them pull back and see the story I'm telling as bigger than any individual person is always a struggle. It's a struggle for me to write. I'm not surprised that it's a struggle for them to learn. I think I mean to go to the next slide.
Okay.
It's funny, I don't use PowerPoint in my class, and so I'm always...
There you go. You just have to make sure it's active on your screen. There you go. Perfect.
All right. So let's ask for a second, what was white supremacy, right? And then let's do, as I often do, let's steal a definition of white supremacy from Stephen Kantrowitz, the author of Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. Borrow. He wants us to use it. More than a slogan and less than a fact, Steve writes, white supremacy was a social argument, both a social argument and a political program. It consisted of ideas and practices, promises and threats, oratory and murder. It wasn't simply slavery redux, right? It's not the same system of ordering people and labor and relationships and politics, just carried straight from the antebellum world. Rather, it was a response to the challenges posed by African-American political participation, by Black voters, politicians, educators, and jury members. White supremacy, in fact, arose from an overthrow of the expanded democratic experiment that was Reconstruction. a democratic experiment led in large part by the visions and ambitions of newly freed people. And white supremacy rose too from a revanchist sort of doubling down, sort of claiming of elite white power in the 1890s. I wanted to pause for a sec and just look at this slide, which is from a gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania in 1866. Clymer, the Democrat, is painting his rival Geary as basically, as he said, basically his platform is for the Negro, right? As if the platform couldn't be for African Americans and white folks at the same time. The kind of depictions, right? The imagery is striking, and it reminds you of how intense this feeling was, how deep the concern, and also how the Democrats are really using Black suffrage and the Republicans advocating for freed people as a cudgel to try to secure victory. Clymer doesn't win; Geary wins. So, at least in that instance, it's a happy outcome. In other words, or to think some more about what white supremacy is, to continue with that definition, you could say that white supremacy was a campaign deliberately waged by white elites to limit African Americans' political, economic, and social power. And this is a big point, to keep other everyday white folks in line. Note that the audience for this campaign button and for the previous flyer, that white supremacy, that they're both of them are addressed to the white voter, right? White supremacy is a rallying cry in this instance, but also a stern reminder that white voters themselves have a duty to vote their racial interests, the Democratic candidates are arguing, above any other interest, whether that would be an interest as laborers, as farmers, as Methodists, as Lutherans, as city folks, as rural folks, what have you, right? That the slogan of white supremacy, the part of it that is a social argument, is about getting people to define themselves through their whiteness first, with everything ancillary. And that kind of racial solidarity that they're calling upon people to make is a demand that they set aside what are pretty serious concerns at the end of the 1890s about new ways in which the economy is being ordered, or the places they're expected to live, or whether their farms are working, or what have you, right? This is a way of having them set aside their other interests to get in line, to actually literally follow the party line. We'll talk about this more in a few minutes, and I saw that Lee Holder asked me about Wilmington in 1898, and we'll come back to the white supremacy campaigns in North Carolina in the 1890s as a sort of example of this. But for right now, what I want you to take away is that the white supremacy that emerged in the 1890s, that emerged after Reconstruction, was neither natural nor inevitable. It was a response to Black political participation, Black political vision, and that I also want you to take away that white supremacy, when we talk about it, we're not talking about a single static thing, right? We're talking about a dynamic system that is made, that is remade, that is protean in nature, and it's remade in response to the challenges posed by social movements, the Black freedom struggle, but also the freedom struggles, the challenges, the ambitions of other communities, ethnic communities, immigrant communities, who have forced white supremacy to remake itself over time. as African Americans combated Jim Crow, sometimes in concert with other people of color suffering under the consolidation of elite white power, they often made headway. And white supremacy, as I said, was perpetually forming and reforming in response to these challenges. So the other thing I want to say, right, if we think it's protean, it is not inevitable, the other thing that I want to say about it is that it was global. The other way of talking about white supremacy is to say that the American white supremacy that we are heirs to, that we sort of live the legacies of, was a vernacular expression of a global phenomenon. The background period that we're discussing, we could frame, as I have, as the progressive era or as the age of segregation when you bring it to the South, or when you bring African Americans into sharper focus. But in the context of world history, it's also the age of empire, right? And that these eras, which we often treat as distinct for teaching purposes, actually overlap and help to shape one another. As W.E.B. Du Bois, towering scholar and activist from, well, almost the entirety, from the born in the late 1860s, dying in the early 1960s, as Du Bois wrote in his early, like 1906 article, "The Color Line Belts the World," the Negro problem in America is but a local phase of a world problem. So if you take a look at the slide that I have here, the illustration that I have here, it's quite literally a sort of literal rendering of the spirit of Rudyard Kipling's poem, "The White Man's Burden," right? The poem that goes, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." The poem, and then it goes on and on and on and on. It's a long poem. But so the poem spoke to what Kipling and many white Americans, sort of, again, elite white Americans, saw as a shared Anglo-American investment and experience in the project of empire. New in some ways for the US. This is coming in the, sort of in the wake or in this, on the heels of the Spanish-American and Philippine wars. Older for England, where they've been in sort of out and about with the sun not setting on the British Empire for a couple of centuries now. But they see the project, again, as paternalist in one way, but something that they're obligated to do because of their belief in sort of white American, Northern European descended peoples' racial superiority. Teddy Roosevelt, who was not yet, but on his way to becoming vice president, and then with the assassination of McKinley, president, wrote to his friend Senator Henry Cabot Lodge that the poem was, quote, "rather poor poetry, but having good sense from an expansion point of view." The point I want to make here, and going back to the system of white supremacy, that's a sort of domestic white supremacy that we're talking about, is that in deciding what to do with what Kipling calls the new caught sullen people, half devil and half child, the experience of African Americans, the experience of managing what they called the Negro problem, would be a key comparison point and sort of learning, a site of learning. Indeed, Jim Crow and American Empire actually came of age together. In the context of territorial expansion, white supremacy provided a certain amount of clarity. As a system of rule, it rationalized unequal power relations, giving a structure and coherence to day-to-day governance. As an ideological argument, it set the conceptual boundaries of the nation. Whether white Americans pondered black folks in California, Creeks in Oklahoma, or mestizos in Puerto Rico, Jim Crow helped them imagine whom they might embrace or reject as their fellow citizens. I mean, actually thinking to like links between then and now, to think about the sort of troublesome location of Puerto Rico as not just a sort of site of American empire, you know, as a territory, but thinking about Puerto Ricans and the difficulty of Americans to imagine them as potential parts of the nation then, and to think about the ways in which Puerto Rico has been left to its own devices in the wake of the hurricane now is a sort of really interesting comparison point. And I imagine in class would open up some pretty rich and painful discussions. So forming a frame both political and cultural, to go back to the sort of the lecture itself, white supremacy joined together arguments justifying white America's hold on power with decisions about how and over whom that power was to be exercised. So that is all in the way of background information. And I've given you a lot of it. I'm trying to shape that.
You trying to forward?
I'm trying to, thank you. It does not like me. I swear I'm on it. So I've given you a quick sketch of a lot of information, and I want to spend the rest of our time thinking through some of this, actually really grounding it in more concrete stuff, and thinking about how the political program and social argument that was white supremacy operated in the 20th century United States. And so there are going to be three questions that sort of hang over the lecture, right? The first is, how did white supremacy set the boundaries of citizenship rights, national belonging, and economic possibility? The third is, how did proponents of white supremacy enforce white supremacy and reinforce it as it was being challenged? And then finally, when did white supremacy lose its mainstream viability? Or perhaps more pointedly, did it lose its mainstream viability, right? If we are to imagine that the civil rights movement, for example, did something, what do we inherit in our wake? Again, coming back to the unwelcome salience of this lecture itself, how do we pull on the context of the past to do explanatory work for the present? To talk about this, we're going to focus on three mechanisms, some of which I'll go into in great detail, some of which I'm just beginning to think through myself and invite you to think along with me. We're going to talk first about disfranchisement and voting rights, something that your students should care about in part because, at least in North Carolina, part of the move to restrict voting rights again now, or to restrict voting again now, comes in the form of suppressing specifically student votes, right? So that's them. We're also going to talk a little bit about legal and extralegal violence, and then we're going to talk about property, home ownership specifically, and federal policy. So that should get us somewhere. We'll have to see where that somewhere is just by talking. Are there any questions?
There are a whole lot of questions, and you know, I knew this would be the case, and so what I'm trying to do is to find the right place before you pivot into a different kind of argument. But I think one that I'd like to pull from our chat box at this point that may be part of this transition comes from Rashida Smith, who's asking, yeah, as you set this up as a global system, in your opinion, and you know, you're both a scholar and historian, but also an educator, and so in your opinion, should we as educators be sure that students have a good sense of this global approach to understanding the ways in which white supremacy has been instituted? How important is that for younger students to really get the way that this is affecting their daily lives?
I think it's important for them to get it, or at least to, this is a kind of wishy-washy answer, but I think I actually think it. I think it's important for them to be aware that it's a thing to get, right? Like it's always hard to decide, are you going to talk big scale or are you going to ground it down so that you can get into the specifics or something, the nitty gritty. The thing about kind of framing things on a global scale is that you rarely feel, or it's hard to figure out how to get it to touch ground. But if you say, you know, this is a vernacular version of something that happens other places, and you tell a US story, and sometimes the way to pull it out and make it a bigger story is to just pause every once in a while and point to the places where you see folks in conversation across oceans or across space, right? So you can talk about the African American struggle for civil rights, and when we get to the part about violence and we sort of look at the document We Charge Genocide, right? That was a document that the Civil Rights Congress wrote up and delivered to the UN because they understood that this was not just a civil rights as in a US issue, but a human rights issue, and that it would resonate with countries that were, or sort of newly forming countries that were breaking off from former European empires. So it might be an issue or a matter not of trying to tell every story, but giving students places where they can see the story they're studying carrying out in certain ways into the world. Does that make sense?
I think it does, and I think that's ultimately what teachers at all levels do, is try to figure out where in that nesting argument we can best fit, right? Whether it's the bigger sort of macro view, or it really comes much more closer to a, you know, to sort of that individual empathy. But yeah, I think it totally makes sense. And then of course there's the geographic component. And before this night is over, don't answer it quite yet. I am gonna, here's a preview. I'm gonna ask you why this particular issue is a national issue and not one located and situated in the South as we sometimes think of it. But
Okay.
We're going to save that one for the very end.
Okay. I bet the answer has something to do with my being a Southerner gone north and annoyed of the lectures that people in Massachusetts would give me about Southern racism as they were telling me the neighborhoods not to go into in Boston where I would get beat up. But there's probably also a more analytical response that I could pull out. So let's talk about the vote for a second, or let's talk about voting and how it came to matter or what it does, right? One of the things we should say to open up this part of the discussion is just that the Reconstruction Amendments were the foundation on which African American citizenship was built after emancipation. I imagine we have a sort of collection of U.S. history teachers, AP U.S. history teachers, in here who drive home to their students what the Reconstruction Amendments are. But just to go over them really quickly, right? You have the 13th Amendment ratified in 1865, which officially freed the slaves. You have the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868, which granted citizenship to all persons, quote, born or naturalized in the United States. It also dictated that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It extended to all citizens the equal protection of the laws, right? It's the sort of key amendment in kind of post-Civil War jurisprudence. It's the answer to Roger B. Taney's Dred Scott v. Sanford decision, where Robert Taney says that a black man has no rights that America is bound to respect. The 15th Amendment in 1870 grants the vote to African American men specifically. It's a touching point, and a point where abolitionists and suffragists split, in part because it writes into the Constitution it's the first official limit of the franchise to men as opposed to women. the 15th Amendment prohibited states from disfranchising voters, quote, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But it did leave open the possibility that states could institute voter qualifications so long as they equally apply to all races. The 15th Amendment was not universally popular. I want to turn to the slide that actually just shows two different representations of Black suffrage. You have on the one hand, again, sort of democratic rallying poster, which shows a sort of chaotic, raucous, again, exaggerated features, almost primitive collection, mass of voters charging their way into a too small door. And then you have next to it what is a Harper's Weekly magazine cover that just emphasizes the dignity, right, of that first older voter, and then shows behind it the African-American soldiers, presumably veterans of the Union Army, who are also casting their vote, right? So one is a lamentation of what Woodrow Wilson would later characterize as dusky children too early let out of school, given the privileges of the vote. The other is a celebration of Black dignity and Black sacrifice, and a very deliberate representation of deservingness, right, of a deserving citizen casting their vote. Implicit in these two representations are arguments about worthiness, whether or not African Americans are worthy of the franchise. But for all of the rhetoric about the fitness of the newly enfranchised voter for self-government, the problem for most people who opposed Black suffrage was that African Americans had too many ideas of what meaningful freedom should look like. White elites' actual concerns centered on Black voters' potential to disrupt a politics that had been designed to concentrate power in the hands of the few. So to see what this looks like on the ground, to see what I mean, let's turn to North Carolina in the 1890s. For some of the folks here from North Carolina, the story will be all too clear. For Democrats in the 1890s, white supremacy was literally a battle cry as they sought to unseat their rivals, the Fusion Party, from state office. An alliance of white populists who were agrarian critics of the region's emerging industrial economy, joined with reformist Republicans, both Black and white. The Fusionists had swept the state elections in 1896. Democrats responded in the 1898 campaigns by excoriating white Fusionists as degenerate sons of the white race. Led by party chair Furnifold Simmons, and publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer, Josepha Daniels, a coterie of enterprising Democrats made white supremacy the key to stifling agrarian discontent and guaranteeing the advance of an industrial economy. Figuring the American nation as explicitly Anglo-Saxon, and Simmons said that expressly, Simmons made loyalty to the Democratic Party a test of white voters' patriotism, as well as a testament, quote, to their manhood, to their pride of race, to their immemorial custom and habit of ruling every other race with which they come into contact. By their zero-sum logic, Black people's gains intrinsically dishonored and weakened white men, and weak patriarchs meant unprotected wives and children. Daniels amplified that argument in the pages of his newspaper by manufacturing a black-on-white rape scare that insistently linked Negro atrocities, as he called them, to the old bugbear of Negro domination, or mixed-race political participation, as the first step towards Black men having sex with white women. So you'll remember the cartoons that we circulated for this webinar from Daniel's newspaper. The Incubus cartoon, which is here on the slide, is the most notorious, but all of those cartoons show a link between voting, Negro domination, and to some extent the exploitation of white women. To combat Negro domination, Democrats seized state offices through force. The red shirts, which were white supremacist shock troops who straddled the line between civic organization, lynch mob, and terrorist group, threatened fusion candidates and intimidated black soldiers across the state. In Elizabeth City, they destroyed the local African-American newspaper and ran fusion candidates out of town. Most notoriously, south of Elizabeth City in Wilmington, the losing Democratic mayoral candidate, Alfred Waddell, led a mob of red shirts, National Guardsmen, and white citizens of all classes in an outright coup d'etat. Rampaging whites targeted the economic infrastructure of Wilmington's African-American community, murdered African-Americans, and drove white fusionists out of the city. There wasn't any rioting, an African-American survivor wrote President McKinley in the aftermath, simply the strong slaying the weak. At minimum, 7 African-Americans died, although estimates range up to 300, and countless others fled the state. Those left behind begged the McKinley administration to do something, but those pleas for help came to naught. McKinley's silence on the Wilmington coup, coupled with the Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was 2 years earlier, signaled to both African American and white Americans that the federal government was out of the business of protecting and preserving black citizenship. Plessy versus Ferguson, as you guys probably know, is the Supreme Court decision that declares segregation constitutional, says that separate but equal is constitutional. What this clears the way for is for states to disfranchise African Americans with the assurance that they won't get much interference. North Carolina disfranchised black voters in 1900, some 10 years after Mississippi had led the way, with a system so thorough that folks referred to it as the Mississippi Plan. If you look at the slide, you can see it was Mississippi, then South Carolina, then Louisiana, North Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, Texas. It's important not to let the slide make you forget contingency, though, right? That there's a way in which you can look at this and think, oh, it was a wave that swept inexorably across the South, when actually in every state and in every moment things could have gone a different way. It's important to keep in mind that people made choices to do this, and they learned from the places that had done it before, but that didn't mean that communities in North Carolina, say, could see this coming in the early 1800s, right? The violence of the white supremacy campaigns were shocking and devastating for people who thought that they were building a good world. The Mississippi Plan included all kinds of techniques for disfranchisement: property requirements, literacy requirements, the poll tax being a big one of them. The Florida, Tennessee, and Arkansas aren't on this timeline, but they too adopted the poll tax. The other strategy that states began to employ in this period was to build on the old English law concept of civil death, which involved disfranchising felons. Mississippi led the way in this too, deliberately tailoring their disfranchisement laws to capture as many black voters as possible, as another means of getting black men out of the voting populace. So they did this by using their stereotypes of what were sort of black crimes to tailor disfranchisement, which means that in Mississippi, folks were disfranchised for arson and theft, but not for murder, right? Because arson and theft were seen as black crimes, whereas murder was seen as a white man's crime. Conversely, in Alabama, they stereotyped African Americans as wife beaters, which meant that in Alabama, one could be disfranchised for beating one's wife, but not for killing her. It's important to think about the ways that terror and these legal manipulations go hand in hand. So with the poll tax, for example, in most places, it's not the tax collector who collects the poll tax. In Virginia, one had to go one place to pay the poll tax, another place to register for to vote, sometimes multiple places to register to vote. And what that ends up meaning is that, one, it inconveniences people, it dispirits them, many people just fall out and stop trying, but it also is a number of different steps at which people can find out that, say, an African American has made an attempt to pay his poll tax, a number of different places where he can be caught out and either turned away or attacked for doing so. At the same time, so what this ends up doing for everyone is suppressing voter registration, voter turnout for all races, cutting down on the amount of voter participation across the South. But there were ways for white men, at least some white men, to get past these requirements. Something called the Understanding Clause, in which the registrar could just give people points for seeming to understand the literacy test. The Character Clause, in which good character could get you around things. The Grandfather Clause, in which if your grandfather had been a voter, then you could vote. Of course, for most African Americans, that their grandparents had been enslaved, so they wouldn't be part of it. In places with the poll tax, political parties could raise money to pay some folks poll tax, right? Getting the folks that they select into the voting populace and thus tilting who's voting and why. So all of this is happening, and even with African Americans in the South, by and large, removed from the voting populace. This isn't true in some urban centers in the South or in select places, but by and large, with them out of the vote, the incubus nevertheless lives on, in part because the threat of black voters remains a way to get out the white vote, to get people in line with the party again, and in the lead up to passing women's suffrage, for anti-suffrage folks to argue against women's suffrage, right? Because any expansion of the franchise sort of suggests a danger that black people will sneak in the back door, for example. Included on this slide is an account of the violence in Ocoee, Florida, the Ocoee election in 1920, Ocoee near Orlando, where African Americans attempted to register to vote. They see it as a year of opportunity. Returned veterans from World War I are pushing for it. Women are pushing for it because the passage of the 19th Amendment doesn't expressly forbid African American women from doing it. So there's energy behind it, but there's also folks on the ground in Florida who are determined that nothing will come of it. So that when would-be voter named Mose Norman makes 2 attempts to vote after being turned away from the poll the first time, white mobs go looking for him, and when they can't find him, again target the economic, black economic and sort of home life, burning black-owned businesses, black homes, and running, killing over 50 people and driving the remaining African Americans out of town. Ocoee, in the wake of this voting day massacre, would be an all-white town until the early 1980s, right? So voting remains fraught And the attempt to vote, the emphasis on trying to get the vote back becomes a means of civil rights organizing, a way to organize, to educate people, and to challenge these sort of entrenched power structures that have come to shape life across the South. The vote isn't an end in and of itself. It is a means to changing bigger structures, but it mobilizes people both to try at the same time that it mobilizes an intense reaction. This fight over voting rights gets deadly, right? This is the story of much of the 20th century, but of the 1950s and 1960s. Certainly, the poster that's on the left of the slide before us invokes Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, through three organizers for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were murdered in 1964 during Freedom Summer, a summer when folks came down to the South, came down to Mississippi specifically, and did a broad voter registration campaign. Other activists were murdered, some attacked, houses were shot up for hosting SNCC workers. People were kicked off of the plantations where they worked for working with SNCC workers. The fight over the voting rights became literally a matter of life and death. It ends after Selma with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, one of the signal legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. I love that picture. I love that woman's hat, but that's just an aside. The Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, changes the game, kind of. It outlawed literacy tests and provided for the appointment of federal examiners with the power to register qualified citizens to vote in jurisdictions that were covered according to a formula provided in the statute. In addition, Section 5 of the Act required covered jurisdictions, again, jurisdictions with long histories of discrimination, to obtain pre-clearance before they made any changes to their voting requirements. The Voting Rights Act is preceded by the abolition of the poll tax in the 24th Amendment, which is 1964. In national elections, the Voting Rights Act directs the Attorney General to challenge state and local poll taxes, and those two are deemed unconstitutional. So it really opens up people's ability to access the vote. But it doesn't do it immediately, and it doesn't do it without ongoing struggle. I think I included in your materials for tonight's session the article about Henrietta Wright, the woman in Winona, Mississippi, who goes to register to vote 3 weeks after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. She's followed home by a sheriff's deputy who accuses her of running a stop sign, but he and she both know why he's pulled her over. The interaction becomes a confrontation. He and a couple of other sheriff's deputies begin hitting her. They arrest her, take her back to the jail in Winona, keep her overnight, beat her to a pulp again, tell her she's crazy if she thinks she's going to vote, and then call in a doctor to declare her mentally unfit and have her put in the state mental hospital for 10 weeks before she's released. We know the story because she comes out and immediately sues them in federal court, right? So she has a sense of her own power. She has an awareness of how she's been injured, but her story tells you that people weren't going to cede African Americans the franchise, even when the federal government was ordering them to do so. What that story also tells you is that they'll find new ways, right? Labeling her insane, arresting her for a different reason, but having it be punishment for this, that what's beginning to happen and what's beginning to get perfected are defined ways to police African Americans that have similar effects, but are presented as race neutral, right? So how does one talk about white supremacy when the folks who are doing the work of white supremacy have removed the language of it from their actions? One of the other things that continues to limit the vote in this period is that the felony disfranchisement continues, and continues to continue. As of 2016, 12 states don't restore rights even after having people have served their prison terms, their parole, their probation, and some post period. These states include Alabama, Delaware, Iowa, Nevada, Nebraska, Wyoming, and others. Another 18 folks keep folks disfranchised through parole and probation, or another 18 states keep them disfranchised through parole and probation. There are only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that don't restrict the vote of anyone with a felony conviction. Overall, 6.1 million people are affected by felony disfranchisement. It's again one of these places where the kind of conversation about intent and effect gets really hazy, right? But whether this is a vestige of the Mississippi Plan or whether this is a deliberate strategy, what ends up happening is that the African American vote is suppressed because this is happening in the context of mass incarceration. These questions and dilemmas of intent versus effect become even more heightened in the wake of Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court decision that basically takes the guts out of the Voting Rights Act. It sort of weakens, strips in some instances, and weakens the sections 4B and section 5 that require pre-clearance before people make changes to voting requirements. What we've seen in the wake of Shelby versus Holder is a waft of legislation in states such as Texas, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, in which the effect and perhaps the intent is voter suppression. And as in the 1890s, the animating claim about why is voter fraud, even as little evidence exists for that claim. There are waves of legislation being proposed in additional cities: Iowa, Arkansas, North Dakota, Indiana, Montana, that will restrict the franchise further. So that's voting.
Adriane, there's a lot of complexity here. I do want to just remind us all we've got about a little over 15 minutes left.
Oh, heavens to Murgatroyd. Okay. Did you say there are a lot of questions, or there were...
No, I just want to remind you, we have about 15 minutes. And by the way, that was an old school exclamation.
I know. I think it comes from a Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
That's Looney Tunes, I think.
So I think that there are a lot of things. I could talk a little bit about white supremacy and violence.
Yeah.
I think that some of it we already know, right? That lynchings, and I mentioned spectacle lynchings at the beginning of the talk, that lynchings spiked in the 1890s, stayed high in the early part of the 20th century. They gradually tapered off as the need to control black labor on the ground, on the farms, in the Black Belt broke up a little bit, right? So that the increased mechanization of agriculture in some ways made that sort of heavy-handed kind of physical violence a little less necessary. That is not to say they ended. One of the shifts that you see happen from the early part of the 20th century to mid-century is that they become more circumspect, right? That lynching ceases to be a broad community celebration of violence and becomes a more furtive kind of terror. Um, but you also get, so the photo that says "Stop the Prison Torture of the Scottsboro Boys," you see people claiming that 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 the sort of legal system, when it's so heavily stacked against African Americans the early part of the 20th century, when they can't be on juries because in order to be on the jury, they take the juries from the voter rolls, and no one's on the voter rolls because they can't vote, right? That these things don't seem different enough from extra-legal violence to really make a point of distinguishing between the legal system and vigilante justice. And then the third photo in this one is also just a nod to the ways in which African Americans repeatedly pointed out and claimed that police brutality, the abuse of African Americans by law officers, was part of the broader structure of enforcing Jim Crow. And this, again, is something that is highly visible in the South, but is by no means limited to the American South, right? So in the document that the Civil Rights Congress carries to the UN Secretariat, where they're listing the litany of violent events that have just happened since between when they first drafted the document and when they do this new version of it, the violence that they're naming, the police brutality that they're identifying, is happening everywhere from Opelousas to Miami to Highland Park, Michigan to Pennsylvania, right? So the folks who are critiquing this violence and claiming it as a human rights issue are deeply aware that they are not just making a claim on behalf of Americans or African Americans in the South. They're saying there's something about the way in which social order has been constructed in the United States, where policing African American people and African American communities and over-policing and murdering them kind of keeps the order going and puts the burdens unduly on them. And it's just, you might say, well, the Civil Rights Congress, I think that they, William Patterson and Paul Robeson were communists. Not everybody felt that way. And to counter that, I would offer you the posters from the March on Washington, right? Where one of their central posters, one of their central demands is, again, this end to police brutality. They see it as a defining issue in 1963, an issue that more sort of expressly militant groups such as the Black Panthers and others would pick up later in the decade. What ends up happening, and then again, this is a question of how does this carry into the 20th century, or into the latter part of the 20th century, is that the Nixon and Agnew in '68, recognizing how LBJ's signing of the Voting Rights Act and the passing of the Civil Rights Act earlier in 1964 has alienated many Southern Democrats from the Democratic Party, they realize that they can appeal to those alienated Democrats, Southern Democrats, using race, particularly if they're careful not to make them feel like they're being racist, right? So the language of law and order comes to be a way of decrying the upheaval, the protest, the just hurly-burliness they see of the Black freedom struggle so sort of speaking on two levels, right? Speaking both to sort of alienated segregationists and people who just want some amount of social peace and don't want to be bothered, not necessarily hostile to the civil rights movement, but just don't want to be bothered anymore with protest. That emphasis on law and order, though, comes to be a cudgel. One, it doesn't address the issues of structural police violence that civil rights protesters have been pointing to, and it becomes to be a cudgel and a way that administrations, Democratic and Republican, subsequently will turn on folks in cities. We have 10 minutes, and I've talked so much, I want people to be able to
there are a lot of questions, but you know, at the same time, you're really covering a lot of ground here. So why don't we take about 6 or 7 more minutes, and you know, if you need to accelerate a little bit, please do, and maybe hit some big points, but we do want to save some time for questions at the end.
Okay. I will actually just do this, maybe not even in 6 minutes. I will make as big a point to it. We could also talk about housing, right? And that all of these things are interrelated. And that when I talk about policing, over-policing in particular communities, what that ends up meaning, or what people end up talking about more and more as we move into the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, is really how cities become these sites of over-policing, and of defining working class or underemployed, depending on their employment situation, defining those folks as criminals first without knowing anything about them. But the question of how do folks end up in cities or in particular neighborhoods in cities goes back to a longer history of how African American home ownership or not home ownership. So I mentioned redlining in this what do you call this, in this slide, and I mentioned the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and then the FHA, which comes right behind it. These government agencies that insured private mortgages, which caused a drop in interest rates and a decline in the size of the down payment required to buy a house. Holt first, and then FHA inherited it and expanded it, developed a system of housing appraisal that used realtors, developers, lenders, all kinds of folks to assess neighborhood by neighborhood over 200 cities. What they did when they did this was to devalue neighborhoods that they deemed as dense, mixed, or aging. If we look at the map, this map of Detroit, for example, you'll see different colors. Green areas were rated an A, which meant that they were in-demand neighborhoods, or, as one appraiser put it, lacked a single foreigner or Negro. These neighborhoods were consistently excellent prospects for insurance. Neighborhoods where Black people lived were rated with Ds and were usually considered ineligible for FHA loans. These are colored in red, hence the term redlining. It didn't matter the percentage of Black people, it didn't matter their economic status. You know, Black people in this sort of FHA logic in mid-century were just considered a contagion. Redlining went beyond Hulk and FHA-backed loans because this was a sort of classification that was adopted by the entire mortgage industry. They also reinforce restrictive covenants. They don't challenge them. So they play along with the sort of discriminatory housing practices that are already in place. What you end up seeing with these maps is that these appraisers are literally mapping existing notions of racial and ethnic value onto homes, onto neighborhoods. And what that ends up meaning is that that is economically devastating, that African Americans can't buy or they can't get insured. What this ends up doing is to restrict their access to real estate capital, and it restricts where they can live. One of the questions of how do you end up with poor cities and wealthier suburbs ties back into the system of classification and these structures that enable certain home ownership for some and not for others. That difference in sort of, or those kind of places of concentrated wealth and poverty will also have great ramifications for financing schools, you know, property taxes, that sort of thing. and which articulates with poor cities finding new ways to fund themselves and their operations. Think of the Ferguson report from the DOJ and the way that they excoriate Ferguson for financing itself by basically criminalizing and then issuing tickets for everything that people do in public space, right? These things end up interlocking in ways that are quite pernicious, but that I would also add are also fixable. So being able to see these structures, being able to see the way that they interlock and they interact and the way that they get made gives us the grounding for making policy decisions that take into account the history and the tentacles that reach back into different times in order to not just pluck off the top, but to really dig out the roots of these white supremacist structures.
You know, Adriane, this map in particular is such a powerful example of the point that you're making, and I wonder, you know, I'm asking you, I think, and maybe all of our participants to consider this, but when you look at these kinds of bigger patterns, in some ways it depersonalizes the issue a little bit, right? It makes it a sort of this institutional thing that we can look at literally from an aerial view. And then I'm going to set that against a comment that Jennifer Ansbach just made. Jennifer is a teacher in New Jersey, and she made a comment that the town she lives in, which is 97% white, just recently opened its first affordable housing complex. And in the sort of the newspaper promotional kinds of things, the police chief was there cutting the ribbon. And so there's a a person chose to be there, a person chose to put him there and to send that implicit message of fear and intimidation and of law enforcement. And so there's this weird balance between the big impersonalized system, yet we can't lose the human agency and individual people making choices to advance this, even just one small, subtle step forward.
I think that's one of the reasons that I like that Doug Marlette cartoon that I included Atlanta because I'm from the Atlanta suburbs. But the Doug Marlette cartoon, which comes after the Fair Housing Act is 68, this cartoon is from the 1980s, and it comes as a part of a series in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution where they're saying not as much has changed as you might think. But if you want how do we go from structures to individual choices and individual agencies, it's the loan officer is a person. The person who makes that decision carries not just the recommendations of federal policy, but their own better or worse instincts and angels into how they treat people. So.
That's correct. And then to take that one step further, when you really get to the sort of base emotional line of episodes like Charlottesville, of the faces of hatred and the things that we all associate with this sort of system, then it's almost as if as teachers we have to really focus on two different lenses. One, because we can't miss that sort of red-faced anger, but at the same time you can't miss this this macro view that is controlling it. So even if that red-faced angry guy carrying the tiki torch in Charlottesville is dealt with, whatever that means, there's still this system behind it that's pervasive and ongoing.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I was inclined to prepare this lecture this particular way is that I looked at Charlottesville and I was horrified. I was horrified by them that they could be that way. But then I thought, that angers me. Flint, Michigan, and the fact that people have not been able to drink their water for a couple of years makes me ashamed to be an American, right? And so to think about, again, what is not that we have to choose between awfulness, right? It's not an Olympic sport, but like, what do we really need to contend with and make sure is working? And I kind of think if we work on the structure, the affective stuff might dampen down, right?
Right. And so it almost asks you to consider both, and maybe that's something that's developmental or it is contemporary and topical. I mean, there is a moment, in late August and early September when, dealing with the immediacy of the sharp knife pain of Charlottesville was important. on the other hand, when that sort of ebbs and flows and those episodes don't seem quite as crystal clear, then there's also lots of time to deal with this larger thing. And Flint's a great example, I think, of something that has sort of slipped out of our media consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, the sharp knife pain of Charlottesville is a lovely phrase and a good way to think about. I mean, that's what it was, right? Like a sort of, it
Yeah.
felt physical.
Yeah, it was stepping on a very long tack when you didn't expect it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh, I'd also like that just as a quick thing in terms of primary source resources.
Please.
The University of Richmond has a fantastic collection of digitized redlining maps. That's incredible.
The Scholars Lab at University of Richmond, Ed Ayers started that, and you're right, they have tons of just wonderful interactive maps. And we didn't talk about gerrymandering tonight, but that's got to be somewhere in this layer as well.
Yeah, and the document from '71 from the Civil Rights Digest that I included points to that too, and it's also kind of poignant because it's an argument for a certain kind of racial gerrymandering that is an argument born of a very different time. But in the prologue, they say something like, it's all well and good to get the vote, but it matters just as much how and whether you can use it, right? And so thinking about what's happening with gerrymandering now makes that seem even far more acute and intense than I think they meant for it to 40 some odd years ago.
That's a great point. Adriane, we're literally out of time, but I do want to go back to the question I posed a little bit earlier and ask you to sort of conclude tonight's session by considering or maybe offering your thoughts on why this topic is a nationally important topic when oftentimes particularly younger students associate racism and white supremacy and the kinds of lynching, these sorts of things with the American South, when of course that's not accurate. So can you describe from your own perspective maybe one takeaway that really brings this out of such an easy local context and makes it more of an American story?
I mean, I think the conversations about policing, right, remind you of how American a story this is and how difficult a story it is to contend with. That's one. There's also, even if you go back into the history, if you think about the history of lynching and that exhibit that traveled of lynching postcards, one of the most striking of those, one of the ones you see most often, which is a person in the foreground turning back and staring at the camera and smirking, is a lynching, I think, from Indiana, right? Mm-hmm. And that alone, it's like the narrative that we have for lynching doesn't account for that location, in spite of the fact that the Klan was powerful and popular in Indiana. So it's twofold. It's don't think of it as just behavior, it's structure, and that's national, but it's also even the egregious and extreme stuff that we're talking about, devastating riots, physical violence, that happened everywhere. And to locate it in the South is to try to excuse America, is to make the South an aberration from America as a whole when it's not.
That's a really great point. Thank you, Adriane, so much for joining us tonight. This is an important conversation. It's relevant, and I think all of our participants really gained quite a bit. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
So we appreciate you joining us today for a long school day. We hope to see you again in one of our webinar series or one of our on-site or face-to-face offerings and activities. You can follow along with the National Humanities Center in our work and education through our social media feeds. That would include Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and Instagram. You can also go to our main web page and see an ongoing and updated summary of the kinds of things that we do with teachers and educators at all levels. I also want to remind you that tonight you will receive an invitation to do an evaluation, and once that's completed, you'll receive an email that allows you to download your certificate. So please keep an eye out for that. Tonight's session, like all of our sessions, has been recorded, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel. It usually takes about 48 hours or so for us to get it processed and online, but you can use that. You can share it with your students. You can have access to the PowerPoint and go back through and really start to untangle the very complex story that Adriane was able to share with us tonight and think of ways to break that down for the students that you work with. Our next webinar next week is almost full, and I would encourage you to sign up if this sounds interesting. We're working with Jim Martin from Marquette. Jim's going to be talking with us about the century of the child, that is the early American 20th century construct of childhood. All those things that we associate with life from 0 to 18, Little League and playgrounds and K-12 education, and all those things that became really a part of our American culture that weren't there before 1900. And Jim's going to really walk us through that and give you lots of different ideas and primary sources on how to think about childhood as a concept. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a great school day tomorrow. Look for that evaluation and certificate, and we appreciate you joining us here at the National Humanities Center. Good night.